Welcome to The Economy Magazine. I'm Benjamin Chong Alfares, and as we celebrate 67 years since Israel's independence today, we take you on a journey through the country's economic history. There's much to say about the startup nation, but where did it all start? With us in the studio to give us a better understanding of what makes up Israel's present-day economy is Jewish history professor Danny Goodwine from the University of Haifa. Professor Goodwine, thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
So, I mean, looking essentially at the history of Israel, 1948, it didn't really specifically start there, right? We had Jewish pioneers coming in the late 19th century, establishing essentially the kibbutz system, which is the beginnings of the Israeli economy. What was here on the eve of the independence of Israel?
Well, what was the eve was that Palestine, mandatory Palestine, that was under the mandate of Britain, was a dual economy with Jewish economy and Arab economy that was in some way integrated and in some ways not. The idea of the partition plan of the UN was to establish two states in mandatory Palestine, but united economically. Mm-hmm. Now, the War of Independence, the War of 48, broke down this dual economy of mandatory Palestine and established the economy of Israel, which was independent of the history of the relations with the Arab economy of mandatory Palestine. And then now the Jewish economy in Israel had its history because it's begun with the settlements in the late 19th century and mainly in the 30s and 2030s. It was built to be a solid economy that was hurt during the war. So when we began the history of the State of Israel, after the war, we have a shattered economy. Well, we have a basis, but a basis that was disconnected from the Arab economy and was severely hurt at the war. So the beginning were not very promising, making allowance for the fact that in that time many new immigrants came to Israel, mainly from Holocaust survivors and refugees from the Arab, mainly from
going
Iraq.
now also towards the 50s, the late 40s and the early 50s?
No, it began already in the late 40s.
Right.
Mainly Jews came from Iraq and Yemen, and all communities there they fled. And so during the war and near after the war, there was this shattered economy with growing wave of new immigrants coming to Israel. That was the beginning.
Okay, specifically, we're talking about the Second World War, of course. We're not talking about the War of Independence.
No, we are speaking about refugees. We're speaking about the War of Independence. In the War of Independence, during the War of Independence, and near after the war, came those immigrants from the Holocaust, from Europe, and from the Arab lands.
Okay. So in terms of the economy that existed at the time, though, I mean, was it essentially a kibbutz-based economy? What was there?
It wasn't a kibbutz-based economy. It was agrarian economy with a basis of some industrial infrastructure, but very, very in its very beginnings. And when we are speaking about the beginning of the 50s, the economy of Israel is completely nothing. It just built itself. And what we have during the 50s is a very fast economic growth. We are speaking about something like 10% a year or something like it during all these decades.
Yes.
Now, this growth is mainly built about the ongoing process of new immigrants who came to Israel and all the building of schools, of housing, and all this absorption of the newcomers, of the immigrants to Israel, gave a great boost to the economy, and so we have 10% a year, and the economy is growing. And so, in the beginning of the 60s, we have an economy that is growing.
Right. I'm just going to interrupt you here. I mean, essentially, it was a socialist-based society, right?
It was the government. Well, the government Israel was basically of idea of welfare state more than a socialist. It wasn't a socialist economy. It was a welfare state economy with a very great public sector that dominated banking, dominated infrastructure, and so on. The Histadrut, which is
The union.
The trade union,
union.
The trade union of Israel had a very massive
Right.
role in the economy, and so it was basically a welfare state economy with large public sector.
Right. Well, Professor Goodwine, I also want to take this opportunity to introduce, of course, Daniel Roth, i24 News journalist. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Specifically, you have an involvement, of course, with the kibbutz movement to some extent, and you are familiar also with the socialist background of Israeli society. What do you have to add to what Professor Goodwine just told us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of trends happening that are interesting and unique to Israel. One of them is, it sounds astounding to a lot of people in modern Western societies that hear about the weight that immigration puts on economies. To hear that in the 1950s, when 10% growth every year based on immigration, and I think that this brings in something, and you mentioned that my connection to the kibbutz movement. There is a social, not socialist, but social aspect to that growth, and that is the question of how you identify, how the absorbing country identifies with new immigrants, and whether they take them in socially. Oftentimes can answer how the economy comes into play.
Right. Now, we just heard from Professor Goodwine, of course, how this influx of refugees, essentially, a lot of them, really did boost the local economy to a large extent. But it also had a very big weight on the economy, didn't it? Because the state essentially had to take care of all these people. I mean, we're in the 50s a time of austerity, of poverty?
Well, the beginning of the 50s, it's a time of austerity. Now we have the immigrants paradox. Immigrants are weight in the economy, but they're also contributing to the economy. So
right.
when you're speaking about immigrants, there's this is a dual impact. Now, Israel was in austerity. There was a period of austerity in the beginning of the 50s. It was when we are going to the late 50s. Now we have the Germany has gave Israel all the contributions for after the Second World War and the Holocaust. So basically, and the United States gave Israel a massive loans, and step by step, I think that the Israeli economy was built on to be from a very, I would say, agrarian economy to more industrial-oriented economy.
I want to take a jump here now, taking from the 40s to the 50s, take us all the way into the 60s and the 70s, when we essentially see a political shift eventually happening, essentially social inequality rearing its ugly head, so to speak, the Black Panthers coming to rise, and of course the political shifts from left to right as Israel moves, as you mentioned yourself, from being more of an agrarian welfare type state to being more of an industrial state.
No, I think that we have to differentiate here between three stages.
Okay.
There is the one stage, the first stage of Israeli economy is up to 67, 68. Well, there is the influx of immigrants and growing inequality. Well, this was the time of inequality because when immigrants coming in, the inequality is growing because they have nothing with them. So it was up to 65. In 65, we have up to 67, we have a very hard period of recession. Mm-hmm. And the Israeli economy is in 2 years after massive recession. And the recession is threatening to explode society. And after this recession, there is a great shift in Israel economy. And from 68 to 77, we have in Israel the great 1 decade that inequality was lowering.
Yeah.
And the government, it's right that from the very beginning the idea of welfare state was here, but in this decade from 68 to 77, Israel was built like a northwestern welfare state with with great education, housing, was improving very much.
Government spending essentially on.
But in this very time, all the inequalities. Now, when you want to lower inequality, people who are on the lower side feel it very, very hard. And that was the time when the Black Panthers, that is to say, lower class Jews from Oriental origin, mainly in Jerusalem, also in the Tel Aviv area, make their demands for more equality.
Is this what brought us to 1977, when we essentially saw the political shift towards the right?
In my no, not only. I would say that the political shift in 77 from a socialist-oriented economy to a capitalist neoliberal economy, I think that this shift was the output or the outcome of two major trends. One was those lower classes who felt that their needs weren't met, and they demanded it, and they voted from the right in order to get better than before. But there was another segment who contributed to this shift, and this was the Israeli affluent middle class, who wasn't ready for this more egalitarian economy that we saw in this decade of 68 to 77.
They wanted to keep what they had.
Yeah, they wanted to keep what they had, and I would say that the meeting, that the turnabout of 77 was the meeting place of those lower classes who were demanding to change the situation with this affluent middle classes who didn't want to give what they had. And that was made the turnabout of 77, and Israel came to be a capitalist neoliberal economy, preaching privatizing, that, you know.
It is part, though, of a sort of a global trend that we saw. I mean, it wasn't just in Israel. We saw it in different places around the world, right?
Well, that's right. The neoliberal trend in Israel wasn't an Israeli, but it has its Israeli specifics. Well, when I'm speaking about the neoliberalism in Israel, we speak about it's part of a global trend, and you know,
Thatcher, Reagan,
Rooney,
you know,
Milton Friedman came. Well, he wasn't responsible for that turnabout, but he came to Israel in 77, in the summer of 77. He was very glad to see what is happening here.
Yes.
Now, but then we have some specific of the Israeli neoliberalism. One is a massive growing of inequality. Because when you privatize the social services and you turn the social services into commodities, it's very clear that the lower classes can't buy these commodities. Right. But these same lower classes were the supporters of the right-wing coalition that governed Israel. And that right-wing coalition has to find a way how to square the circle between the neoliberal policy and the will to keep their consistency.
So looking at this period, though, in the 70s, I mean, how did this set up the Israeli economy for the 80s? The 80s saw a period of great recession.
Yeah, I would say that in Israel we had great inflation. First of all, from 77 to 85, Israel is undergoing a massive inflation that
it reached up to 1,000%, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I would say that in its height it was 444%, but it was you couldn't manage in that time, and right. In 85 we have this economic plan who put an end to inflation and began the new neoliberal Israeli economy with massive privatization. Here you can see the economic division of Israeli society. Those who haven't are trying to get through the political power some social services, so they are sectoralizing themselves. They're becoming political sectors. Right. They are forming political parties that are fighting for getting not welfare state, but in a way, in a state that is privatized, to get some services for their constituency. And in that sense, you have very Israeli, this is unique Israeli thing, that you have so-called social parties who are supporting privatization, but within the framework of privatization, they try to keep their constituency in a better place.
Would you say it's fair to note that the forces that were in power essentially at the very beginning in 1948 and before then essentially kept much of the resources and the money all the way through? Or do you see, I mean, to some extent we see a lot of innovation coming from the IDF and from the way in which technologies are brought into the civil society? I mean, presumably IDF is a place where it kind of is more distributed more equally. Where does that inequality actually stem from?
Well, the inequalities stem from policy. You know, in Israel we have from 77 on a policy that want to redistribute, and this redistribution is forming new classes and new powers. So in Israel today, take the kibbutz movement. Almost nothing is left from the kibbutz movement.
Right.
Take the trade union council, which is of immense economic power, nothing left to it. So in Israel, you can see really an economic revolution that was taking place in the last 3
Professor
decades.
Goodwine, we have to stop here. Thank you so very much for joining us, coming all the way from Haifa University. And of course, Daniel Roth, thanks for being in the studio with us as well.
Thanks.
That is the end of our Independence Special, and that is the end of our Economy Show. Thank you very much for watching us, and join us again tomorrow for more in the economy.